4 billion miles from the Sun, the light arrives cold and almost useless, not dim, not reduced. At this distance, solar radiation is roughly 1,000 times weaker than it is on Earth. Standing on the surface at noon, you would not squint. You would see a sky as dark as midnight, with a single bright point where the Sun used to be. The temperature never rises above -390 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself freezes solid and settles onto the ground as snow. Nothing moves, nothing cycles, nothing should be happening here. For 76 years, that is exactly what we assumed. Then we looked. In 2015, after 9.5 years of travel at 50,000 miles per hour through complete darkness, a spacecraft arrived and had 6 hours to observe the surface. 6 hours. The data it sent back contradicted nearly every prediction planetary scientists had built around this place. The surface was active. The atmosphere was structured. There were mountains where no mountains should exist, moving in a direction that required an explanation no one had prepared for. And at the center of it all was a feature so large, so clean, and so geologically impossible at this temperature that the models did not survive contact with it. This is what was actually there. The prediction going into the New Horizons mission was well supported and straightforward. Pluto sits 3.67 billion miles from the Sun. At that distance, internal heat from planetary formation should have radiated away billions of years ago. There are no significant tidal forces acting on its interior. No nearby massive body to flex and reheat the rock. No ongoing energy input of any measurable kind. The surface should be static, permanently, completely frozen. That prediction held until the first high-resolution image arrived. Stretched across Pluto's equator was a pale, roughly heart-shaped region nearly 1,000 miles wide. Scientists named it Sputnik Planitia. It is a massive ancient impact basin filled entirely with frozen nitrogen, methane, and carbon monoxide. The unusual feature was not its size or its chemistry. The unusual feature was that it had almost no impact craters. In a solar system accumulating collision scars for 4.5 billion years, Sputnik Planitia was nearly unmarked. That cannot happen passively. A surface that clean means craters are forming and being erased on a continuous basis. Old impacts are being consumed. New surface material is cycling to the top. For that to happen, the material inside the basin has to be in motion. For material at -390 degrees Fahrenheit to sustain that motion, there has to be an energy source driving it. Solar input at Pluto's distance is nowhere near sufficient to drive convection in a nitrogen glacier. The heat has to come from inside. A trace of residual radioactive decay in Pluto's rocky core, faint but real, rises upward and reaches the base of the glacier. It causes the frozen nitrogen to convect in large, slow cells, rising toward the surface, cooling, sinking back down, rising again. The cycle takes hundreds of thousands of years to complete, but it does not stop. Any crater that forms in the basin gets gradually pulled under. The surface stays pristine because the material beneath it never fully stops moving. To understand how significant that is, consider what the heat budget actually looks like. The radioactive isotopes responsible, primarily uranium, thorium, and potassium-40, were present in Pluto's rocky core at formation and have been decaying ever since. On a body this size, with no mechanism to replenish or concentrate that heat, the output diminishes steadily over geological time. By the age of the solar system, the rate of decay has dropped to a small fraction of what it was at formation. The heat flux reaching the base of the glacier is not large, it is just barely enough, and that margin is precisely what makes the convection possible, and precisely what makes it so unexpected. A slightly smaller body would have lost that margin entirely. A slightly more distant orbit might have tipped the energy balance the other way. Sputnik Planitia exists and actively resurfaces itself within a very narrow set of conditions that Pluto happens to satisfy. That forced an immediate revision. A body at this distance, with no tidal flexing and no meaningful solar input, should not retain detectable internal heat after 4.5 billion years. But the basin proves it does. That only works if there is more internal heat than the baseline model allows. And if that is true, the surface activity is not the main problem. The real question is what else that heat is sustaining deeper down. The edges of Sputnik Planitia are where the second problem becomes visible. At the boundary between the nitrogen glacier and the surrounding terrain, there are mountain ranges, not surface ridges. Full mountain ranges reaching 11,000 feet in height, with sharp angular profiles showing no signs of erosion or atmospheric smoothing. They are composed of water ice. At -390 degrees Fahrenheit, water ice does not behave like the material familiar at Earth temperatures. The molecular lattice locks rigid under extreme cold. It becomes structurally comparable to granite. It does not flow, does not sublimate at any significant rate, and does not compress meaningfully under the pressures present here. Water ice at this temperature is, for practical geological purposes, a permanent solid material. That explains why the mountains are tall and why they have held their shape. What it does not explain is where they are positioned. Water ice is less dense than nitrogen ice. The glacier-filling Sputnik Planitia is composed primarily of nitrogen compounds, which are substantially heavier for the same volume. That density contrast has a direct physical consequence at the margins where the two materials meet. The water ice mountains are buoyant relative to the nitrogen glacier. They float. Mountain ranges detach from the basin's edges and drift across the surface of the glacier, carried by the same slow convection cells keeping the surface active. Structures that took billions of years to form are being transported across a moving surface, silently, continuously, which means the surface beneath them is not stable, and if the surface is not stable, then the structural integrity of the crust at the margins of the basin becomes uncertain. And if that boundary is not stable, then the shape of the basin itself is not fixed over time. The edges are moving. The footprint of Sputnik Planitia is changing, slowly but continuously, as the convection redistributes material and the mountains that once defined its boundary drift away across it. What this also means is that the history of the basin cannot be read from its current shape alone. On most planetary bodies, the geometry of a large impact feature is a record. The basin tells you how big the impactor was, how the crust responded, how the terrain settled over time. On Sputnik Planitia, that record is being continuously overwritten. The current shape reflects not just the original impact, but billions of years of convective modification, mountain migration, and margin shift. It is a geological feature that is actively erasing its own history. There is one more layer to this. The peaks of these drifting mountains carry dark reddish deposits concentrated at higher altitudes. The pattern is consistent with material settling from above. The source is photochemical. Ultraviolet light from the distant sun strikes frozen methane on Pluto's surface and drives a reaction producing complex organic molecules called tholins. These compounds are dark reddish-brown. They form in the upper atmosphere and precipitate downward, coating exposed surfaces continuously over time. The mountain peaks are not bare ice. They are covered in organic chemistry, produced by what little solar radiation reaches this distance, accumulating layer by layer across billions of years. Organic molecules confirmed at the surface, internal heat confirmed below. The question is whether anything connects those two things through the layers in between. That requires looking underneath the crust entirely. For decades, the standard model described Pluto as frozen solid from surface to core. No liquid layers, no subsurface ocean. Just a rocky center surrounded by undifferentiated ice all the way up. That model does not survive contact with Sputnik Planitia. The nitrogen glacier is enormous and exceptionally dense relative to the surrounding terrain. On a slowly rotating body, a mass concentration of that size creates a gravitational torque. Over millions of years, that torque causes the body to reorient, rolling until the heavy region migrates to align with the tidal axis pointing toward Charon, the largest moon. This process is called true polar wander. Sputnik Planitia sits almost exactly on that tidal axis. The alignment is precise and almost certainly not coincidental. For that reorientation to have proceeded at the rate the orbital mechanics require, the interior of Pluto cannot be a rigid solid throughout. A completely frozen body resists internal redistribution. The reorientation stalls before it reaches completion. Without a fluid interior layer, the reorientation cannot occur. And since the reorientation clearly did occur, the solid body model fails. Not as an approximation, not at the margins. It fails as a description of what actually happened inside this planet. The only interior structure consistent with the observed alignment is a subsurface liquid ocean, sitting between the rocky core and the frozen crust, kept liquid by the compressive pressure of miles of overlying ice and by residual radioactive heat rising from below. Current estimates place it roughly 150 to 200 kilometers beneath the surface, potentially several hundred kilometers deep. This ocean has been liquid for a significant portion of Pluto's 4.5 billion year history. It is not sustained by proximity to a tidal heat source the way Europa's ocean is thought to be. It is sustained entirely by pressure and ancient internal heat at the outermost edge of the solar system in complete darkness. Consider what that pressure actually represents. The ice shell above the ocean is estimated to be between 150 and 300 kilometers thick. The weight of that ice pressing downward lowers the freezing point of the water beneath it, preventing it from solidifying despite the extreme cold at the surface. This is the same mechanism that keeps water liquid at the base of glaciers on Earth, but operating at a scale and under conditions that have no parallel anywhere in the inner solar system. The ocean is not liquid because it is warm. It is liquid because it is buried under an enormous amount of frozen weight, and because just enough heat from below prevents the pressure equilibrium from tipping toward complete freezing. Remove either of those conditions, and the ocean does not exist. Both have to be present simultaneously, and both have to have been present for billions of years. The model requires this. The orbital data requires this. And the alignment of Sputnik Planitia with the tidal axis confirms the reorientation happened, which means both conditions were met. The tholins forming at the surface are confirmed. The liquid water layer is required by the physics. Whether any pathway connects those two things through the crust is a question that cannot be answered with the data currently available. New Horizons flew past in 6 hours. There is no lander, no instrument capable of probing the interior directly, no funded return mission. The ocean, if it is there, will remain unexamined for the foreseeable future. The model did not just underestimate the surface, it assumed the wrong interior state entirely, and an incorrect interior assumption changes the baseline for every other body in the outer solar system that has been modeled under the same solid body framework without ever being visited. Pluto does not exist alone, and the system surrounding it follows the same pattern. Expected conditions do not describe what is actually there. Charon's diameter is roughly 51% of Pluto's. The mass ratio between them exceeds any other known planet-moon pair in the solar system. As a result, the shared center of mass does not sit inside Pluto. It sits above Pluto's surface in open space between the two bodies. They orbit a shared point in open space. By definition, this makes them a binary system. Both are fully tidally locked to each other. Pluto always presents the same face to Charon. Charon always presents the same face back. From Pluto's Charon-facing hemisphere, Charon sits fixed in the sky permanently. It does not rise, it does not set. Cross to the opposite hemisphere, and it is never visible at all. The practical consequence of that permanent visibility is worth pausing on. On Earth, the moon moves across the sky, rises and sets. Its position changes hour to hour and night to night. It is a dynamic presence. On Pluto's Charon-facing side, Charon occupies a fixed point and never moves from it. Any process that depends on tidal interaction between the two bodies is constant and directionally unchanging. The tidal bulge Charon raises on Pluto does not sweep across the surface as the moon moves overhead. It sits in one place, permanently, pulling on the same region of crust for billions of years without interruption. The long-term structural implications of that kind of sustained directional tidal stress on Pluto's ice shell are still being modeled. The gravitational coupling is tight enough that gas escaping from Pluto's thin atmosphere does not always disperse into space. A portion drifts toward Charon, reaches its polar region, and freezes onto the surface. The result is a large, dark, reddish deposit covering Charon's north pole, called the Mordor Macula. It is chemically consistent with Pluto's own atmospheric material. Pluto is depositing itself onto its companion across 12,000 miles of open space, and has been doing so continuously since the system formed. Orbiting the central binary pair are four smaller moons, Nix, Hydra, Kerberos, and Styx. Their rotational states are chaotic. They tumble unpredictably on their own axes while completing their orbital paths, a direct consequence of the complex gravitational field produced by the binary pair at the center. They were most likely produced by the same giant impact that created Charon, and none have settled into stable rotation in the billions of years since. The Pluto system is not a planet with an orderly satellite family. It is the unresolved product of an ancient collision, still expressing that instability in every small body orbiting within it. Here is what the accumulated data actually says. The baseline prediction for a body at Pluto's distance was inactivity across the board. Heat gone, surface static, interior undifferentiated, no atmosphere of consequence, nothing moving, nothing cycling, nothing sustaining. Every major finding from New Horizons contradicts that prediction directly. Active convection in a glacier that should be inert, mountain ranges floating across a surface that should be fixed, a subsurface liquid ocean required by orbital mechanics to explain a planetary reorientation that clearly occurred, organic chemistry forming continuously from photochemical reactions in a place receiving almost no solar energy, a structured, layered atmosphere, two bodies in a binary configuration actively exchanging atmospheric chemistry across open space. None of this was expected. Each finding required revision to a model considered settled before the flyby. The reason this matters beyond Pluto is what it implies about the framework itself. The assumption driving every original prediction was that energy availability decreases predictably with distance from the Sun, and that below a certain threshold, planetary activity simply stops. Pluto demonstrates that internal heat sources, pressure-driven phase states, and gravitational coupling between bodies can sustain active processes far longer and at far greater distances than that framework accounts for. The outer solar system contains dozens of bodies that have never been visited. Their interiors have been modeled under the same assumptions that failed at Pluto. Some of those models are almost certainly wrong for the same reasons, and there is currently no data to identify which ones. We had 6 hours to observe a world that has been operating continuously for 4.5 billion years. What those 6 hours produced was enough to revise foundational models. What remains unknown is everything a single fast flyby could not detect. Pluto is still there. The convection continues. The mountains drift. The ocean has been liquid since before complex life appeared anywhere on this planet. The models did not fail because Pluto turned out to be an unusual exception. They failed because the limits built into those models were drawn in the wrong place. Pluto is not the outlier. It is the first correction.